Mortal Kombat Trilogy. A game so fondly remembered around the world, and although it's not everybody's cup of tea in a competitive sense, the game really stood out to fans, as pretty much the first time a Mortal Kombat game ever approached the entire let's put everyone in one game idea. The roster was sizable, and every character at the time was present in one way or another. A game that released in the mid-90s and marked the end of the head-to-head 2D graphics Mortal Kombat we'd grown so used to, this was also an important shift in the series as a whole, because Trilogy was the first Mortal Kombat game of this style to not see an arcade release and be a console-exclusive title. As it was the 90s, and console gaming was seeing such an insane rise to power, various games would often be ported onto other systems, with Mortal Kombat Trilogy being no exception. Today's video covers the various ports that Mortal Kombat Trilogy received. The good, the bad, the everything in between. The idea is to give you as broad of a picture as possible, to both show the various ways that Trilogy could be played back then, but also show the various differences from a hardware point of view, as not all systems that had this game were identical in power. It results in some incredible games, and others that are, shall we say, not so good. This is Mortal Kombat Trilogy in all of its various forms. Okay, so I'm going to give you a totally stripped down overview of the game first, because it is important to give you a clear idea over what Trilogy actually is before going over the ports which have the various inclusions and features. As a base level, Trilogy is built around Mortal Kombat 3. The run-based movement and jumps, the throw system, the dialer combos, everything that players experienced in most likely Ultimate MK3 first was seen in Trilogy. It functioned slightly differently as Trilogy ran at a different frame rate to arcade MK3, but the basics remain the same. The roster was the largest we'd seen yet. It had everybody from Ultimate MK3, plus some MK2 characters like Raiden and Baraka, and even Johnny Cage, who in this game was motion captured by a different actor, Chris Alexander. The boss characters were here too, covering everybody that we'd seen at this point, and the otherwise Super Nintendo and Genesis exclusive ninjas in Rain and Noob Saibot from Ultimate MK3 were fully playable in Trilogy as well. For many players of this time, this was actually the first time people really got their hands on them. Trilogy added a mechanic called Aggressor. A meter will build up at the bottom of the screen, and when it's full, it activates automatically, giving you a slight damage boost. Most competitive players would turn this off in the options menu, but it is there, and it was a Trilogy exclusive feature. A lot of other features are specific to that version of Trilogy, and it must be made clear immediately that the basics of Trilogy are different depending on which console you're running it on. And this is where we're going to start going over the ports one by one. The first, and the one I kind of want to get out of the way as soon as possible, is whatever the hell this is. Oh, right. I've covered handheld ports in the past, but this one really bothers me. For those that do not know, Tiger Electronics was somewhat of a household name back in the 90s, but not necessarily for the same reasons as other video game companies. Tiger consoles were often standalone handheld games, specializing in one specific game that already existed most of the time, and the idea of these was, hey, you know this popular game that you really like? Well, now you can play it on the go! But the game itself was nowhere near what it was originally based on. You pretty much had this small screen with a bunch of images on there, and they kind of show up at different points to kind of give you the illusion of animation or gameplay. Even as a kid, when I had some of these, I'd play it for about 30 seconds and get so bored with it that it just gets stuffed in a drawer and forgotten about. I actually own a Mortal Kombat one of these, and let me tell you, it's not good. This company made a handheld system in 1997 called the Gamecom, and the Gamecom did more than play games, but it had its own library of them, and they were sold as cartridges, one of which just so happened to be Mortal Kombat Trilogy. And it is the exact kind of handheld port that I hate. A game that kind of looks like the Mortal Kombat games, but from a gameplay sense is absolutely diabolical. The first problem is that the roster is really small, and it's missing Scorpion and Sub-Zero. It really took me back when I saw it for the first time because, I mean, how can you miss these two characters? Like, why would they do that? Secondly, and this is a big one, it plays like shit, and I mean really shit. There's an element of familiarity here with high punch, high kick, low kick, block, you know, the stuff that you'd expect, but it's just so stiff. There is a run button here, but you barely cover the distance. There is a stamina bar, but you barely notice it. It does have finishing moves, and they look atrocious. But this is what I hate about these handheld ports. They focus so much on trying to make it at least look accurate with some sprite work and somewhat familiar animation, but the gameplay is never something that works. The moment you jump into the game, you spend most of it trying to just get your special moves to come out, or even just hit the opponent because the AI tends to go nuts immediately. Now, it does technically even have aggressor, but it's barely noticeable, just like stamina, because it builds up really slowly. Okay, the furthest I got was Shao Kahn. You reach the boss characters and they genuinely beat you in 2 hits. It is the laziest form of boss scaling I've ever seen. Nothing changes about them, they just do over half your life on a single attack. You can easily beat the computer by doing a neutral jump kick in the corner over and over again. You can do the same thing to Motaro if you don't get hit twice. And honestly, that's it. There's nothing else to say. It's a terrible port. It plays nothing like Trilogy. It's missing characters. I genuinely don't see the point in why this game ever came out. Okay, now we've got the stinkiest version out of the way, let's talk about the real versions, starting with the more obscure of the console ports, which is the Sega Saturn. The Saturn wasn't really as well known during those times when I was a kid. I didn't actually know anyone that owned one of these, but I don't have much to say about the console itself. I just never saw it, and nobody I knew had one. I always heard that the Saturn port of Trilogy was worth looking at though, and to be honest, I can see why. This version of Trilogy, like the PlayStation and PC, has more content than the N64 version. It provides the largest gameplay package, as it has all of the characters, plus the extra secret versions of some of the roster, which is MK2 Kung Lao or Jax, MK1 Raiden or Kano. These characters were all, in their own way, pretty busted and extremely strong, but they were only playable in these versions. Additionally, the secret character Chameleon was exclusive in this version of Trilogy as well. The thing is, the Saturn port of Trilogy is the exact same game that exists for PlayStation and PC, and it does a totally fine job of running it. I must say that I notice barely any substantial differences between this and the PlayStation version, but there are a few, although rather small ones. The Saturn version of Trilogy came out roughly 1 year after the N64 and PlayStation, and it was developed by a company called Point of View, who also made the PC version, which released at a similar time to the Saturn port. The changes to the Saturn version are almost entirely cosmetic. It didn't have the same transparency effects of the PlayStation, and it had an almost mesh-like effect to replace it. The more noticeable difference lies in the audio. For the most part, it's very similar to the PlayStation, but some of the samples sound either strange or just different. But again, it's nothing game-changing. It's just there. The biggest thing I can say about the Saturn port of Trilogy is that it is so close to the PlayStation version, and by far the closest to it in terms of overall experience, and the load times can be very similar, which is something that is sadly an issue for both of those versions. But what I mean by all of this is, if you really wanted to play Trilogy, but you only owned a Sega Saturn, you weren't missing out that much if you eventually got the Saturn port. It's not like it's magically worse than the PlayStation, it's very, very similar. And when I look at the online discussions that compare the two, it definitely seems to be more of a matter of opinion. Sega Saturn Trilogy, well done. The PlayStation version of Trilogy is the one that Mustard and myself had when we were kids. It was such an iconic game to us because, remember, back then you couldn't easily get your hands on the arcade experience of Ultimate MK3 or something, and the Super Nintendo port of vanilla MK3 that we had wasn't particularly accurate to the arcade either, although I have to say, those ports on those systems weren't terrible. But without an arcade to go to, and no way of experiencing the game in its most true form, PlayStation Trilogy was the closest thing that we had, and back then, we could barely tell the difference. It was pretty mind-blowing. Nowadays, and something I've actually covered in detail, is that we know what the differences for the Trilogy version are, and the game stands as its own thing compared to Ultimate MK3, but the PlayStation version gave you a really good experience. In turn, it meant that the Saturn version did as well. But the PlayStation version of Trilogy had fewer noticeable issues with the small visual stuff, or the unusual sounds, with them either being present or sometimes missing. It had the same roster, the same modes, the same everything really, which does bring me to an issue that both of these versions had, and that is load times. Load times were really annoying in Trilogy, and you had to load into getting into a match, you had to load into the versus screen, you even had to load and wait if you wanted to do a Shang Tsung morph. It was hands down the worst thing about these ports, but sadly, CD-based games all seemed to have this problem back then. Trilogy wasn't the only game that had this problem. But it does seem, however, that there were things in place to try and limit that load time. If you went to the options menu, you could actually change the character select screen. You could remove the versus screen. You could even alter the Shang Tsung morphs to different levels to reduce the load time mid-match. I gotta give the team credit for this, because it's clear that the load time was considered in development. I mean, it was hard to miss, so having any options at all to try and limit it, that's a nice touch. This version of Trilogy is, from a casual level, often the most preferred, as it has the most content, the clearest visuals, and the most distinct soundtrack, which was kind of just a pitched-down version of the Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 soundtracks, but it was still really good. It was something about the ease of access with the PlayStation, the fact that so many people had the console, obviously the multiplayer aspect of it, and the smooth controls of the PlayStation pad. I think a lot of things were just going well for this version. It just, sadly, suffered heavily thanks to the load time. Now, the N64 version is where things take a pretty substantial turn. It is different in many ways, while keeping the fundamentals of the giant roster and familiar faces. However, in many forms, this version is extremely different, almost entirely due to the difference in hardware. The first thing about it is that it has less characters. The alternate versions of Raiden, Jax, Kung Lao, or Kano are no longer present, and neither is Kintaro or Goro. Male Chameleon is not in this version, and is instead replaced by Female Chameleon, accessed differently as you have to input a special code in the story screen. From there, you can select Chameleon in Character Select, rather than the old version of selecting a ninja and holding a sequence of buttons. Another thing about this version is that the visuals are not as crisp, and the music is substantially worse in quality. This stuff, however, is again due to the difference in hardware, so a decline in visual and audio quality is not something that's particularly surprising. The one benefit to the cartridge system of the Nintendo 64 did mean, though, that this version has no load times. The N64 had a 3v3, where you could pick 3 characters each and jump into a much longer battle, a mode that a lot of people favoured. Now, I already know what you might think here. It has worse visuals, worse sound, a smaller roster, so this version is just bad, right? Funnily enough, it tends to actually be the preferred platform of Trilogy with the competitive scene, because mechanically, Trilogy on the N64 plays completely different to the others, and actually provides an experience you can only find with the N64 version. A fun fact about this is that it sports one of the most dangerous or broken versions of Sub-Zero in Mortal Kombat history. You see, instead of having Unmasked and the classic Sub-Zero in the same roster, this version of the game actually combined the two, where you have classic Sub-Zero with his relaunch combos, his amazing slide and the ground freeze, but they also gave him the ice clone and the ice shower from the unmasked character. This one's often referred to as Super Sub-Zero because he is totally ridiculous at high level. But speaking of high level, this is where the N64 version heavily takes off into its own thing. A major difference with this and the other versions is that attack frames are heavily different. Many attacks have different levels of recovery on block or hit, and it actually changes the meta of how the game is played competitively. Something as simple as a low kick or a high kick has less recovery on the N64, which makes them more usable buttons. The game changer here is how low pokes are dealt with, something like a crouching kick or a crouching jab. In other versions of Trilogy, or even Ultimate or Vanilla Mortal Kombat 3, these low attacks were mostly used as a one-off get-off-me tool, something to interrupt an opponent's jab pressure to give you some breathing space. But in this game, these buttons actually give you free pressure if you're fast enough. And being able to hit a low attack, gain plus frames, and then go in to start your own offense, it's an entirely different dynamic to what the other versions provided. Now, I've covered this version in detail in previous videos, and it always gets me thinking about the same thing. When I was asking Trilogy players about the different versions, I usually was told that this is their favorite version, because it's different mechanically. It gives players a unique experience, and it offers something more than just a bigger roster. It is how different the N64 version plays for experienced players that it has often made this game the version of choice. These differences are due to all types of different reasons though, and I don't think the difference in stuff like frame data was intentional, but even if it was an accident due to, I don't know, saving on cartridge space or something, it was a game that you could only experience here. And if you're a hardcore classic Mortal Kombat player, a game that is drastically different to Ultimate MK3 is simply a new addition to your library and something new to explore. And finally, my personal favorite version, the PC port. This is essentially the same as the PlayStation and the Saturn, but with no load times. Now I'm going to start here by assuming that the game wasn't always this fast. The PC port of Trilogy feels way faster than the Saturn and PlayStation versions. But this version is also being played using a modern platform, as I purchased mine from Good Old Games last year. The speed is noticeably fast, but with PC games, especially old ones in this age, it's kind of hard to get many of them playing the right way, especially the way they did back in the day, in my experience. So I sadly cannot say for sure if this is what it was like in the 90s, but if you played this version yourself back then, by all means, please let me know in the comments section. This port has all the content, a satisfying speed, and extremely fast load times. It feels like the fastest version by far, but it has none of the issues that the other ports had. It simply has everything and good performance. Now sadly, I can't really comment on the PC port from the old days. I don't have an old machine to run it on, and there's absolutely a chance that using my modern PC to run this game, let alone digitally, is going to give some unintended results. However, it is very much a result that I enjoy, and it's pretty hard for me to find fault from a single player standpoint. But overall, the experience of Mortal Kombat definitely changed from system to system if we're talking about Trilogy. They all had some differences in their own way, with some of them barely noticeable, and some so glaring that it's barely even the same game, isn't it? But a story of Mortal Kombat in the 90s, and one that I've thoroughly enjoyed telling. I grew up here, and I played all the different consoles, and I experienced all the different games, no matter the franchise. And I gotta say, it's a special part of my growing up, and it's just not the same today. By all means, let me know what your favourite version of Trilogy is, and I thank you all very much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.